Thank you, Paul. And hello and welcome to this evening's Empower Hour. We are delighted to welcome former PUC Chair Jeff Ackermann as our guest. Now I would like to go ahead and move to the acknowledgement, the land acknowledgement that we do before each Empower Hour. We acknowledge with respect as non-native people that the land on which we stand, live, and learn is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize that the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that our government, academic, and cultural institutions and our nation itself were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, oppression, and inequities, and to recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, create, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Let us seek to understand what it means to be in right relationship today with the traditional stewards of this land and with this land itself and all the creatures that inhabit it. And now I would like to welcome our guest and introduce Jeff Ackermann. Has been in the service of Colorado energy consumers for over 4 decades. He is probably best known for his tenure between 2017 and 2020 as chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. During that tenure, Jeff presided over Boulder's municipalization proceeding version 3, the transition away from fossil fuel dominant electric resource planning, and the emergence of new planning efforts concerning the distribution system and vehicle charging. Jeff also served as at the PUC, as an advisor and chief policy advisor to the commissioners from 2007 to 2013. As executive director at the Colorado Energy Office, also known as CEO, from 2013 to 2016, Jeff directed the Hickenlooper administration's engagement at the PUC, as well as with the electric cooperatives and their wholesale provider, Tri-State. During this time, CEO initiated community solar dedicated to income qualified consumers, a dairy farm efficiency initiative with the electric co-ops, the beginning of a multi-state commitment to EV charging corridors, and set the groundwork for innovative financing of clean energy, CPACE, and the Green Bank concept. Twice in his career, Jeff has directed the state's delivery of residential efficiency weatherization services to income qualified households, and has also advocated for these consumers while serving at the Colorado Energy Assistance Foundation, now known as Energy Outreach Colorado. Jeff works part-time at the Center for New Energy Economy, CNEE, at Colorado State University, advising state legislators, utility commissioners, and governors' offices on clean energy policy. He is also a senior fellow at Gridworks and board chairman at the Alliance for Collective Action. And in addition to all these amazing contributions, a fun fact that we have learned is that Jeff worked at PSCO from 1995 to 1999, and towards the end of his time there was able to negotiate 6 months off, during which time he traveled the globe with his wife and kids. So without further ado, Jeff, please, it's all you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks to the Empower Our Future group for inviting me. Yeah, thanks for inviting me in. It's a pleasure to be with you all, although I can't see all of you. We'll get a chance to dialogue soon. I look forward to that. So I do look forward as much to your questions as to my presentation with each of you. I would also share that I appreciate peoples and organizations who take that effort to use words and expressions to acknowledge our history, acknowledge our whole collective and individual history as a culture. And I appreciate that. I hope that in a small way, I'm mindful as I'm sharing with you my words that they are an expression to you, good folks, of ways that your mission and purpose can be carried out better. So I'll use that as sort of a charge. So I'm going to draw upon that experience that you heard talked about there at the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, at the Energy Office. And I'm at that phase in my life where I can say I'm just drawing upon life experience too, or moving into those hopefully someday wisdom years. So with that, let me tell you what I have in mind to use our time tonight. I've put together a loose agenda. We'll see where we get through this. And what I really had in mind is I love the fact that as an organization, you talk about a mission of advancing a socially just, clean energy economy. I'm going to talk to you about regulation in that context. So you saw the title of our presentation being, regulation. Is it a tool or an impediment? And I shared through Mary portions of my background of how many times I've interacted with the regulatory sphere to touch upon that side of this conversation so that you understand that there's a reason for regulation, there's challenges to regulation. Many of you good folks who are listening in this evening are well-versed in that, are very great participants and such, but to step back and look at that from a, how does it work for us? And I'll use a couple case studies. We'll talk about electric resource planning, ERP as we all know it, and planning more broadly as a regulatory practice. I'll take the risk of talking about municipalization with a group who has this as something they probably chat about at breakfast once or twice a week, and see where we get with that conversation. And I want to talk about the money side of electricity and utilities. Although I'm not a finance-based person, I think it's a critical part of understanding where we are and where we go from here. So from case studies, I'd like to look ahead and talk about if our goal is whether it's zero carbon, 100% renewable, how do we achieve that in real terms? How do we look to that? How do we look to that as a blue state sitting here post-election in a country that's going through transformation? How do we look at the headwinds of higher costs, and why I bring up that third bullet in case studies about the cost of electricity? So we need to see that as a context. Again, I think most of you know a lot about these things, and so I'm going to kind of tease them out, talk about them at a fairly high level, and see where they take us so that we keep going through that. But I want to move forward to this notion again, to this socially just clean energy economy, and look at how exactly do you advocate for that as a comprehensive vision? How do you keep that comprehensiveness and look at the fact of how do you pursue social justice in the electric space, in the utility space? And this question that's both rhetorical and very real, of kind of progressive communities really engage effectively and coexist effectively with investor-owned utilities, knowing that objectives are at odds, and how to engage in that space and work in that tension. And then finally, as time allows, and keeping some quick time in this, bring you to the fact that there is different forms to take your mission, your purpose, your vision, and channel them and figure out what form or forms works best for you, and to contextualize that a little bit, to understand the context around what you're trying and desire to accomplish, and where does it best fit into which of these different forms of policy and social change. So that's what I'm hoping that we'll use. So with that, let's jump into a first planning overall. I would start by saying, first, in the world of electric resource planning, that I think the key thing is to pull back the veil on this and have you think about things that maybe don't look as obvious from your side of the dais, from the bench, but things that are critical to understanding, is this an effective space and how to use it most effectively. I'll start with public comment hearings, because I have engaged with many of you, I'm presuming who's on the call, on the webinar, who have done both an admirable job under public comment hearings of understanding how to articulate a message, how to connect and ground a message very effectively in rule or statute, telling the bench what rule or statute you're referring to, what's the point you're trying to make. And that is admirable. And I think I found it appreciative as the chair, because the key part of public comment hearings is in the legal vernacular. It is a much lower standard of the record than the cross-examined portion of the record because it has not been cross-examined or in effect vetted by folks challenging what's being said. So it makes it challenging for folks that put their time and effort and talent into those hearings, the public comment time, to feel, was it a good use of time? What I've tried to do, and I hope some of my successor colleagues have done, is to take those comments, and that's why we try to have these comment hearings early in a adjudicatory time, and then weave them into my cross-examination so that it becomes part of the official record. And so watch for that and see if that's happening or not, because it's important to see, is all of that effort having an impact? And that's a rhetorical question for you right now, but thinking about, what are you getting out of those hearings? Does it feel like it's working for you? Another example from resource planning from my last experience is we spent a wonderful amount of time. I mean, wonderful, not sarcastically, but wonderful in that we have very high quality intervening parties who come into these proceedings. And a couple of them, if I recall, Sierra Club, possibly Earth Justice, made a really compelling case about the performance of Comanche 3, the latest and last coal plant in Pueblo, and asked some questions about when the plant was not performing and it was found to be a deficiency of equipment. How did the company handle that deficiency? Who paid for the remediation of the deficiency? And how do you handle a circumstance when a plant was approved to operate at a certain cost and a certain level of performance, and it doesn't? And should there be cost disallowance? It was a fascinating point to see, in my opinion, looking back on that, that there was a clear case for a deficiency there and a finding of a deficiency, but we did not disallow costs. And it's interesting to reflect upon that as to why we didn't. And was it a kind of element of fear? Was it just the challenge of the litigated process that tumbles down upon making a decision like that? Or is it just that that's uncharted territory for most commissions? But I think, again, what I want to take and bring to you in this slide is to ask you kind of to look at insights into the process, and from a simple kind of return on investment point of view, is that been an effective use of your time in the system? And is the system working for the public in that regard? I'll leave that as a first thought. We'll come back now and look at planning as regulation, this other part of this first case study. What I want to bring your attention to here is the fact that I admire that Colorado does a very substantial and substantive job doing resource planning. We're a case study. We're a model for the nation in how we do that. It's extremely rigorous. It tends to work fairly well. It has its own issues, but it is an onerous process. And even at the end of the day, makes one wonder, what did we accomplish? But when you look at where we are now in planning at the commission, because the legislature has been so positively active in this space of electric utility performance, we now have electric resource planning, demand side management planning, which is what brought me as a staff to the commission in 2007, renewable energy standard compliance planning, transportation electrification planning, distribution system planning, beneficial electrification planning, and probably have others I'm not thinking about. We do some planning around income qualified services. So we have an amazing amount, and is it an inordinate amount of planning that really is not getting to the heart of steering utilities to deliver to the public, to the common good, in the public interest, what we really need out of this process now. I think a lot of it also comes down to, it's a practice of a follow the money, that each of these planning practices has accelerated recovery. The utility puts money out, and rather than wait for a rate case, rather than wait for it to be put into a discourse upon what is an appropriate amount to recover and then to collect it, they're put on as riders or surcharges on bills. And so we have a fascinating and terrible amount, I think, of surcharges on bills now. Using my own bill as an example, I draw your attention to the fact that the 7 or 8 things I've highlighted there are various adjustments, all to steer the utility in a certain direction. Transmission cost adjustment for things we want them to do in that space. The other things I spoke about, demand side management, purchase capacity cost adjustment is for the utility to accelerate recovery when it's buying power from others. The transportation electrification, renewable energy standard, RDA, which is going to escape my mind right now. Each of these in an average month was at least 14% of the bill in this case, which raises an interesting question that what you have here is each of these is a way that the utility company's risk is substantially mitigated, almost down to no risk, that they put out money one month and they see the money come back the next month. It's not only not a risk, it's hardly even a release out of one pocket before it's back in the next pocket. So it's something to watch to say, is this an effective way going forward for us to steer the utility regulatorily toward to the types of things we want them to achieve, and how does it impact costs? Because the 2024 legislature did pass yet another piece of legislation that is going to now allocate costs for distribution system planning, because the folks, especially my colleagues over at the Colorado Solar and Storage Association and others, pushed to bring that forward as a way to get more attention on distribution system efforts to make solar and storage more accessible, which again, a noble effort, but it's yet one more thing on the bill. And so it begs that question, is this working for us? One more piece under planning before we move to another area, performance incentives, because I'm touching on this notion of how does the state, through its commission, through the public, on behalf of the public, steer the utility in where we want it to go. This aspect of performance incentives has been out amongst the leading edge commissions and states for a number of years. Very challenging, but to figure out how to use what draws the utility's attention, and that is earnings and profit, to steer them where we want them to go, or what is known as PBR, or performance-based regulation, or performance-based rate making. There was a study called for in 2019 in Senate Bill 236 to ask the commission to, or directing the commission to study such and report back to the legislature on how to do such. We were at a time where the commission had numerous things it was tasked to do. This was tasked to Commissioner Gavin to take the lead on. I tried to jump into this process toward the end of the report before it went public to really push a very simple but strong message to say it's not a lot of incentives, but it's few very effective incentives that would be the best. And for example, if most important to us in Colorado is emissions reduction of greenhouse gases, and we know we have statutory minimums of such, we can measure those items both on a cost basis of how much it costs to achieve that, and set a baseline for such, and we know what years they're supposed to be achieved by. Using those two metrics, we could have used incentives to say, if you get there cheaper and faster, you will earn more for doing such. I tried my damnedest to push that into that report and had to fight my own staff, or not even my staff, and the other commission there on this to even get missing an opportunity there that's slowly working in, but working in at the speed of what the utility wants, I'm afraid. Going to the second case study, and the one that comes with both trepidation and sort of an interesting moment to talk to many of you, because knowing your background as an organization and as a community, I got to experience municipalization and Boulder's efforts in what I'll refer to as version 3, because it came to the commission 3 times. And I think in the need of kind of offering full transparency, at least from my point of view, because everyone has a piece of the truth. When I look at what was transpiring when this came in front of me as the presiding chairman, it was an interesting question as to why is it coming a third time? What happened in the last 2 times? And it's worth understanding. One time when the city was coloring outside the lines of using the distribution system map versus the city's legal boundaries. And then a second time when it wasn't quite clear what it was trying to accomplish. It was sort of interesting to understand by the time it got there in version 3, I would beg for you to think about rhetorically and beyond, what was the city really trying to accomplish at this point? Where was it, where was the zeal? What was the efforts to negotiate? The point being is, I think there's a backstory going back to the very origins of this, of whether the city actually wanted to have a municipal utility or a better negotiating position to put forth certain expectations or certain demands upon the utility. That the negotiation did not work out well for various reasons, and thus that long game of trying to direct the utility to deliver better for Boulder became well, let's see if you can really build your own utility or not. So something to learn from in that experience. So what was the objective back then? And to reflect on your thoughts on the process and what did we learn from that process? There's a lot that could go into that. I don't need to go through all that, and we can do some question and answer on that. But I think there's something to learn there to understand motivations, because motivations drive objectives and drive process and drive success and failure. I think there are thus these lessons to be learned about as a community still hungry to do better and to do it in ways that are somewhat unprecedented and stellar for what we're trying to accomplish, of what best gets us there. I know to part of your community as well, you're also looking at these other options such as community choice energy, or what California calls community choice aggregation, that was pushed forward in 2021 through a House bill referenced there. And I think it's, again, begs good questions beyond rhetorical as to, is that the path that gets you where you think you're really trying to go? And what is it you're trying to achieve? And what's the best way to get there? Because I'm trying to tease that out for you as we get a little further into this conversation and get into Q&A, to get your thoughts on how to clarify what you as an organization are trying to achieve, what you as a city and a community and as part of a state are trying to achieve. And is this the best way to get there? And what are the other options for you? As those other options come to mind, hold that thought, because I want to kind of take you on a little journey as to where to take those other options and possibly how to achieve success in different ways. Let's go to a third case study then. Electric rate setting, the whole notion of how utilities live and breathe, investor-owned utilities. And the proceeding I presided over in 2019, the advice letter of 286. And the heart of these cases, although they are rigorous, they're dense. In this case, the utility themselves brought forth 22 witnesses. And at the heart of this is often, what is the return on equity that will be set for the utility? I think it's so fascinating as we went through this, and the grief that was kind of signaled back to me from the utility themselves when a decision was made not in their liking. But to realize that return on equity and the understanding of equity as opposed to debt, which is other people's money, equity being your own money, is to understand how are we treating the utility in this space? And is it, are we maltreating them? Are they getting away with something? What's going on here? To look in this space with the utility, that this notion off to the right-hand side is a realization that across the country, they're getting about 10 to 12% return on equity across the country, and how that's performed. In Colorado, in this proceeding, the parties came out with, the company came in at 10.2, the staff of the commission at 9, the Office of Consumer Counsel, now known as the Utility Consumer Advocate, Colorado Energy Consumers, which is the industrial customers, U.S. Department of Energy came in, the seniors came in indirectly and without offering their own number, but just gave a general advice. So you can see where it was set. The advisors came in public and thus said to us, we think 9.39 with a bandwidth of 9.2 to 9.62. And then my colleagues each took the opposite end of the bandwidth. And we had more of a kind of a bartering, like at an auction house, than a really well thought out discussion in some ways. But we ended up at 9.3. Whether, that is 9.3 high, low, good, bad, it leaves one feeling unfulfilled as to this process, and knowing how integral this is to how the utility perceives itself. There's so much more that can be done in this space. But behind this, what I want to really draw out is I found it fascinating to be able to go online and look at this is return on equities for different types of ports and segments of the economy, the U.S. economy. This is after R&D is taken out, this middle column. This is before R&D. And utilities down here at 11.15. So that's what I was saying in that other chart. It's right in that range. And to see that, I highlighted some in green, how hospitals are at 62% and computers and peripherals at 52, but broadcasting at -2, or biotech at -4, which makes you wonder if this is good data. Real estate development, ups and downs. But the point being is we're dealing with a unique entity here of regulated entities that are getting, fairly generous, but will tell you they don't feel it's enough return on investment. But there's a wide diversity in this space. But the question is, what is reasonable? Always comes up. And what often becomes the situation is utilities compare themselves against each other versus comparing themselves against what are we trying to accomplish and how does this relate to the allocation of risk. I think there's a lot of work that could be done here. There's a lot of good public policy in rethinking this more fundamentally, because there's a long history here that has not been really pushed upon for some period of time. So, but I think understanding that this is supposed to reflect risk and reward, and utilities are unique amongst the economy and unique with a few other partners out there that do not have the same risk as others because of the regulatory structure they live in. We'll get to that in just a moment. First, I want to talk about costs. I commend to you the good work at Energy Innovation out in California and some work they did here this summer in trying to make sure people understood that it's not clean energy that is driving price spikes in electricity, but that there are many other things going on in here. And what they tried to show is we have a long history of the residential price of electricity. The rate of electricity tends to mirror pretty well the consumer price index in regarding inflation. You'll see more recently, it's getting out ahead of that now, and that is causing some clamoring amongst average consumers and voters as to what does this understand. I think the question here is to try and understand why are costs going up in this transition to clean energy era. I think some of this has to do with sort of, we are in a time where, although we're moving toward clean energy, which has zero cost for fuel, we are still paying for the old assets, and we're in a transition where we're paying for both. So we're seeing the delayed benefits while incurring the current costs. The report goes on to show 4 key factors I want to talk to you about regarding what's causing electric costs to go up. The first is natural gas price volatility. It speaks to North Carolina and showing that North Carolina went through a very sizable increase in residential bills since 2017, and that as an outlier or not an outlier, and that we've seen market spikes around the country. We had the weather spikes of Superstorm or Hurricane Uri, international disruptions, different things that remind us that natural gas is a volatilely priced product. And then to bring it home, Colorado, after that winter storm, and then saying, hey, these are costs we did not anticipate, and we have the right, we contend to pass these on to our consumers, had 500 million of a request of, I think, 515 million passed through to gas and electric customers. So that factor that put forth in the report is very real here in Colorado. Secondly, it brings up this new and disturbing factor of wildfire costs and how we allocate risk and deal with risk. Using California as a leading state example shows that there's been, across the investor-owned utilities in California, 16% of the reason why costs are going up is due to wildfire costs and risks. And so, and showing that there has been between 10 and 24% of that in just 2023, 2024 alone. Here in Colorado, I think they're possibly third, Xcel's filed their either second or third wildfire mitigation plan, calling for 1.9 billion in a multi-year request for allowance to expend for wildfire mitigation. That was just filed this July. That's going to be a significant factor put forth against 1.3 million customers or thereabouts. And as a multi-year piece, that is just the next phase of wildfire mitigation planning related expenditures. Third factor that the report brings up is the ongoing transmission and distribution related investments, seeing how these have gone up 64% in the period of 2016 to 2023 in billions of dollars. And when it comes to revenue requirements, which is basically the utility saying, this is how much we think we merit in an annualized basis to run this utility appropriately, it's gone from 20 to 33% of that revenue requirement amount. And in the 12 years noted here, 13 years noted, is transmission and distribution investments now. We're seeing more and more of those costs are related for things you're hearing more commonly about: adaptation, hardening, resilience, how to make systems survive changes in weather, changes in the impacts upon weather. So we're seeing that as a major burden upon electric systems. Again, bringing it back to Colorado, first, the Power Pathways investment, which is intrastate transmission investments out in the Eastern Plains, hovering in just shy of $2 billion for that investment, which is to tap more of the Eastern Plain resources and make that system work better to deliver wind generation into the state and out through the state to other markets. And then secondly, I draw your attention to article. This is October 31st in the Denver Post, showing Xcel announcing $45 billion in investments it plans, about which half is Colorado investments. This is not all transmission distribution. But the point being is we have a future of very robust amount of capital investment to contend with. And so that's a third key factor to be aware of. Fourth, we have systems that are aging. They have uneconomic plants. You have good folks amongst your organization, both, I admire folks like Leslie Lustrom and others who both, to my earlier comments, know how to channel people to effectively engage with the commission, but also know how to analyze and bring forth cogent data such as Xcel's engagement with coal as a generation asset and coal as a fuel source, and bring that into the conversation. Across the country, we're seeing still these plants, which are steadily getting into retirement and being used less, if not at all. But still, the costs are there. And those costs to consumers are still rolling until they are truly not only retired, but they're not needing to be paid for anymore. Again, in Colorado, we're looking at the Hayden plants retiring later this decade, in Comanche 3 at the end of the decade. So we still have plants in that realm that are, thus we're still incurring costs for. Finally, a few other key things to note that come out of the report, and that is that earnings and profit, not just to the ROE I spoke to, but more broadly, just the fact that how utilities operate continues to be a major driver of costs because they have such an incentive to make, as my earlier slide showed, $45 billion in investments, and see that really no downside to that, or very little downside, because it helps their earnings and thus helps their profits as well. Looking at Xcel using 2023 data and trying a rudimentary version of what someone like Leslie does much more eloquently, and looking at Xcel's 23 year-end earnings reports, they have about 1.77 billion in net income, over an overall revenue of 14.2 billion, which tells you that they're at about 12.5% of revenue for earnings and profit. So it's an interesting thing to realize, that this is a company doing fairly well, if not very well, and that has nothing but incentive in a lot of ways to keep operating in this model, because these types of numbers tell them as a board and as a investor-based, investor-driven company, keep making those kind of investments because it's what the shareholders are looking for. Get a pivot away from this conversation now, and I want to just take you to a couple other topics to put in front of you of thoughts that have been on my mind for several years, especially since I left the commission. The first is this notion of the regulatory compact. And this is where, one of the things, and I do appreciate having your audience to speak to this about, because I have spent a lot of years both as a commission staff, as a commissioner, and now in my time with the Center for the New Energy Economy, still trying to help people understand the history of regulation so you understand why we do what we do and how we could do it differently. What I mean by that here is that we have this relationship between the public through government and the utility. It goes back across the country and in Colorado to about 1900. And in that relationship, the investor-owned utility receives a captive market. They receive investment incentives and basically a near guaranteed earnings and profit. And they also, in return, provide basically safe, reliable, effective, and reasonably priced electricity. That's the compact. That's the relationship that was established over a century ago. At this point in time, when it started, the role of electricity was basically, lighting was a novelty. It showed up in wealthy homes, and it was starting to kind of become an intriguing thing that those who could afford it would add to their homes. And in industrial processes, we were replacing steam-based power with electric power. That was really where electricity was connected to us as a society, some 125 years ago. You now move forward 125 years to where we are roughly today. And the electricity now is integral to the basic existence of life in this society. You do not live a functional life without access to electricity today. And so I contend that we can estimate a subsistence level of electricity for someone living in Colorado. I would say in a rough back of the envelope estimate that about 400 kilowatt hours per month is somewhat of a subsistence level. A refrigerator, lights, and charging your phone, living in an apartment, something like that. So, but the point being is the compact has changed because that 125 years later, the IOU still receives that same part of the relationship of a captive market, investment incentives, this near guaranteed earnings and profit, and then, as I showed earlier, even more incentives to do other pieces of work. It still provides safe, reliable, effective, and reasonably priced electricity, but What if we updated the societal expectation upon utilities and said, what if we said to you, anyone who is income eligible, you delivered 400 kilowatt hours per month at cost. I'm not asking you to subsidize, since that's not your job, but I'm not asking you to earn on those people in need and to provide this societal benefit at a profit and earning. You can get your earnings on the rest of your business. But how do we start to think about changing the relationship between the public through government and a utility, an investor-driven utility that's been asked to deliver something into society that of which the need for has changed dramatically in 125 years. So I think that's a key piece of where we need to take the conversation. I would offer you one more thing because of my background in working with the income qualified folks. I think you can use that premise and start with that as the first building block of a better way to do comprehensive energy assistance. You bring that approximately 400 kilowatt hours at cost into a relationship between the utility and that income qualified customer. You add on to that this push that I'm proud of what I did at the energy office and is continuing on, where we try to dedicate more and more community solar to income qualified households. And it tends to work out about 200 kilowatt hours per month, tended to be a number we were working with in the past that comes in at a very low cost, a few cents per kilowatt hour. So you now are up to about 600 kilowatt hours potentially for this household. Then you start to say, okay, that's where we bring in the different payment programs that are compelled upon the utility as part of the planning process of percentage of income payment, ways we match payment to what you can afford. And then on top of that is where we then bring in the assistance, the different payment assistance programs through Energy Outreach Colorado or the Low Income Energy Assistance Program to help you when you're still short on being able to make your bill. And then always adding energy efficiency on top of that. If we looked at income qualified work this way, we could truly make a standard of how to reduce energy burden as such, using that as a template of measurement of, are we having an impact upon those in need? But how do we thus change our thinking from begrudgingly having utilities say, yeah, I understand my role in this, and we'll make sure we allocate, or credit those leap payments to the right person's bill, et cetera, to say, how do we actively engage all parts of society and utility and others into something that really yields an affordable approach to energy for income qualified folks? That's something else I would put in front of you to ponder. So from there, I think I'm drawing to a close for you to say, what I wanted to ask you about is to think about the idea of thus with what you desire to achieve and what your experience has been in trying to achieve policy objectives, and to the mission statement you've articulated for your organization, which forum best works for you. So let's talk about the Public Utilities Commission first. So as option A, you have a place where it obviously knows and does work on rates and charges and tariffs. It's called the legislative function of the commission. It makes decisions on a just and reasonable standard, generally within a broader nebulous public interest standard. So that is one of the key functions of the commission. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a question of whether that is still holding its own against steady increases in the cost of electricity, or is just a structured way to channel those increases forward. We have other litigated proceedings, such as known as applications. This is the adjudicatory function of the commission, where it uses strict jurisprudence parameters and is purely a public interest standard. This is where we do resource planning, demand side management planning, all the other planning proceedings, and similar proceedings such as that. That's the heart of the commission. And then its third piece is non-litigated proceedings, where the commission's either in rulemaking or in miscellaneous non-litigated proceedings, miscellaneous or investigatory dockets, engages the public, tries to draw out information, tries to signal to the public and more so to the utilities, the regulated entities, this is what we would like more from you. This is how we would like to approach these issues going forward. That's one path. Many of your folks know that well and continue to use that. It's not necessarily, not productive, but it's a question of how effective it is relative to the amount of effort put in there. The second path, always available to you then, is the General Assembly, is the legislature as a forum to look at and where to go in this effort. I would contend if the focus changes to something such as more broadly consumer protection or understanding consumers and updating that regulatory compact with the investor-owned utilities, assisting those in need at cost, and other ways to look and say, all of us are feeling a burden of cost increases, those headwinds I mentioned at the start of my presentation regarding costs. This is a place to put some better parameters around that, because I think you're seeing, even in the decision coming out this week in the gas proceeding, I believe it was, it is very hard to get in front of those filings, those advice letters saying we need more money and for this reason, and to totally shut it down. The Black Hills case coming forward right now in electricity, that will be and has been put before the commission to say, we want you to approve zero. So it'll be interesting to see if that is at all within the realm of reality. Similarly, to my point about financial incentives and the use of return on equity and risk and reward, and using different signals to steer the utility more effectively toward what the society wants. There is so much more work beyond what was done in 2023 by Senator Fenberg and his counterpart, the Speaker of the House, in their special committee on legislation called High Utility Bill Committee, that did some good kind of nibbling around on this and starting to constrain and restrain some of these costs that go into automatically being recovered by the utility. So much more that could be done here. And also how to use and understand where market competition should be involved, and whether it's in solving distribution issues all the way on up to how market competition is used in wholesale generation now. But what could be done more effectively there, starting with conversations and legislative directive coming from engaging legislators in writing laws about this. Third, thus how to kind of clarify and streamline the PUC decision-making process. I've done a number of presentations to legislators in my life at the Center for the New Energy Economy, looking at, in states that have not gone as far as Colorado, how to signal more effectively to your commissioners that in making those public interest decisions, it's a phrase that is used a lot, but is never defined in statute. And if it was to be defined in statute, great use of your legislature to define it in a way to say, commission, it's still your job to make the decisions, but let us tell you, when you make a public interest decision, we want you to make sure you have included the following criteria. And here's an example of types of criteria. And it could vary by state to reflect the culture of the state, political culture, but the impact on price, impact on emissions, impact on local economies, impact on system resiliency. There's many things, but right now that is left nebulous, and it's left to the commissioners to decide what feels like is a public interest factor. But I think that is a great way to steer potentially better decision-making. These are just some examples of things that could be brought forward through advocacy work at the legislature. And I would be remiss, because we're 2 weeks out from the election, to just kind of touch upon where we started. We live in a broad world where we've had impacts that we're sometimes learning to admit to and try to respond to. But 2 weeks ago, we learned a lot about ourselves as a country. And we learned in part that based on exit polling, based on NBC News, if you look at what's on people's minds, look at how many people in the red, in the Republican side who won the election, 90% about immigration, 80% about the economy. Those are the big factors. And then from there to foreign policy. I draw your attention to this to say this is where the focus is of folks who are voting and are sending people into power. And a key thing to be aware of here, amongst other things, is there's nothing in here at all that talks about climate, about energy, about utilities, anything to even get a toehold on to what we're talking about here tonight. And it's a challenging thing to at least realize at a national level. And so as a result, the economy shows up, but the climate dates a big zero and on this, trying to understand where do we go forward in energy policy nationally. Bit different on the state level. State level, I was appreciative of Axios trying to analyze what happened in Colorado. They said, 5 takeaways. That the top of the ticket was still a Democratic-dominated ticket. The second piece was that there were Democratic-backed ballot measures, such as abortion rights and taxes on guns, that worked their way to victory. At the same time, although I would contend and I don't know how you all voted on the item about peace officer training and support, but $350 million now will have to be found in a state budget that doesn't have $350 million for more peace officer training and basically widows assistance for peace officers killed in the line of duty and other related things like that, which was clearly, in my opinion, just another way to chip away at the effectiveness of state government. keep that in mind, that that's what's going on in Colorado. Fourth, Denver's always an interesting laboratory. I appreciate volunteer-wise doing legislator kind of advocacy work in Denver. We've voted yes for more money for healthcare, which is a regional service, and for another school bond. Voted no on affordable housing money. Interesting to try and interpret that, but that tells us something about where voters are at. And I thought it was interesting, Axios said Western heritage prevails. This is basically the prohibition on big cat trophy hunting failed, as well as 2 animal initiatives in Denver failed. I just draw your attention to this in closing to say, of all the things that are on your mind to try and achieve, whether it's in Boulder, the greater Boulder area, or in the state at the legislature, and I commend you to think about what could be done at the legislature, that we live in a state where there is a democratically controlled legislature. That is in our best interest in many ways. The governor's a wild card in these conversations and will continue to be for the next 2 years. So the political outlook is a bit cloudy. The winds of change are hard to read there right now, but I think there are great opportunities there just the same, but you have to think very carefully about what your messages are as a result. And I would contend that messages are going to have to be more savvy, more tied to the economic needs and concerns of the average voter and citizen and resident, as to I hesitate to call it a selfish mode, but a kind of what's in it for me mode to think about in this space, but to ultimately think about what is the churning out there in the policy space today, and how do you match your message to what's there versus try to think that your message will win the day. So how to rethink that message. That's why I bring to you those thoughts about income qualified customers, those thoughts about the economy and how it's influencing this discourse, and writ large, what's going on in our churning policy environment, to bring that back to the PUC and back to the legislature, 2 places that I think you have great opportunity. With that, I appreciate you listening in. I look forward to now some dialogue.
Thank you, Jeff. That was fabulous. It was fascinating with a lot. I'm really glad this is going to be on our website recorded, because I'm going to want to watch it again and hear a lot of those points again. That was great, very helpful. We have a large number of questions in the Q&A, and I'll just take them as they came in. This one from Martin Volker. Many years ago, there was money dedicated to fund citizen organizations to argue in front of the PUC as a needed counter to Excel's legion of high-paid lawyers and lobbyists. Is there a chance to resurrect this?
Yeah, and I'll try and answer each of these succinctly to get through as many as possible. There is still an intervener fund, as it's known. And there's a high bar in rule to how you achieve that fund. You have to show that what you brought into the record had a substantial impact on the outcome of the proceeding. Fairly high bar there. I think it's a good place to engage again with the legislature, not necessarily to open it so that you can just bring in more advocates, because that's not necessarily the solution. That could be a little too crude, but I do feel there are ways, and I have used this example over the last 3 years, because we now have law on the books about bringing equity and environmental justice into proceedings. I think as parties withstanding, and a lot of you know who those are, as those parties who know how this process works, were to bring in a wider swath of experts. Those experts and the cost of those experts should be compensated through that fund. So to use a case in point, take Western Resource Advocates or SWEEP or the folks if they brought in a environmental justice advocate, rather than make an environmental justice nonprofit, get an attorney, learn the process, pay the fees, incur the costs, have them hire a staff or consultant out of the EJ equity and make them a witness to WRA or to SWEEP or to whoever, and then bring that piece of cost out and have it agreed upon in advance that those costs, regardless of what side of the question they advocate for, will be covered by that fund. That's how you bring equity and EJ into it, as one small example. So it is there. It's hard to access. There's ways to improve it. I think the legislature should be involved.
Great. Thank you very much. Here's the next one from Evan Ravitz. Excel Colorado's president testified to Boulder City Council that 2/3 of electric rates go to transmission and distribution. Shouldn't the PUC be insisting on incentivizing in-home solar, perhaps as Germany did, to save our rate dollars and minimize power line wildfires land needed for utility scale solar and power lines, et cetera?
Interesting, complex question. Separated out transmission and distribution. I think transmission is going to be a Wild West conundrum for a number of years because there is both pressure, and this current commission is signaling they want to see how Colorado better connects to the West for the net benefits. So asking for like to see a line from Craig to northeastern Utah so that XL and Tri-State can better connect to Pacific Core. There is needs for that, but I think part of the question is it's sort of an unbridled ongoing. I saw it put it in one of my slides of how much is in that space. In the transmission side, it needs better oversight to decide which investments should actually be made. Our Colorado Electric Transmission Authority has some emerging role there, more intrastate than interstate. I think we have to watch how interstate decisions get made in the future. That is a wide open piece that does not necessarily have cost as its objective or consumer needs as objective. On the distribution side, I think it's begging. I like the example I've often used is XL should be, and any, Black Hills should do the same. When they see they need a piece of the grid updated, changed, improved because it's at capacity or aged out, I think they should be put in a position to write that as a RFP to the market and say, this is what we need based on what's happening on this piece of the distribution grid, and let all comers make all proposals and see what best serves that solution. I think we find it would be a mix of utility-owned solar and storage at the substation. It would be a blend of the utility bringing in targeted rates and targeted incentives. It would be the market bringing in solar and storage. It'd be a different time of day use of energy efficiency or load shifting. I think if we opened it up that way, I think the market could answer a lot of that. And I agree, it would be a way to push down on distribution investments.
Great, thank you. The next one from KK Duvivier, you mentioned that you thought there was a basis for disallowing costs at Comanche 3, but the commission did not do it. Can you share more about why not?
Okay, Counselor. As I say, I think it was my recollection is that the three commissioners, and in looking and talking with their advisors and their counsel, were feeling probably fear at the end of the day that are we truly in a good position, or are we ready to suffer the proverbial slings and arrows to go through the litigation of actually telling the utility, you are not going to recover costs on this. And I think that was what happened there, that there is such lacking precedent of disallowing costs of that, especially of that magnitude, that it was a kind of sense of the folks in the process saying, I don't think we're up for it. That's my candid answer to it. I'm not happy with that answer, but that's my sense of it.
Thank you. Next from Joe Braden. Thank you very much. And you touched on PSCo's return on equity, as well as the fact that their risk is quite low. Some of us scratch our heads as to how the alignment between those two is justifiable.
Yeah.
Are there factors we're not taking into account?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the biggest factor is probably just history and precedent, and we've allowed this to happen for way too long. And I think we've allowed investor-owned utilities to sort of grow out of the area we had them in and move toward wanting to be seen as just any other business and be the best part of your IRA, of your retirement fund. And one of the things that I am intrigued with, and I think, again, whether it be a legislative initiative or a regulatory or not, is to answer that question in part by saying, why do we apply the same return on equity, the same ROE to every investment the company makes? Why don't we subdivide those investments in 8 or 10 parts? That if you're investing in IT for a computer system for customer billing, there's just shy of zero risk there. We can probably figure out what's an appropriate return on that, as opposed to when you truly take a risk and you try a new technology, or you try a new approach to meeting load or shifting load, or a new creativity of a blend of generation assets. I think we want to dangle higher ROE to say, try that. But I think you could parse out the distribution system, the transmission, the generation, the billing, other incentives, and you could, it takes some work, but I think it's the good work to be done to put an ROE on each of those.
Wow.
Say the ROE will match to the risk.
It would be much more differentiated. Yeah, thank you. Here's another one from Julie Sennheiser. Mr. Ackermann listed a great number of PUC planning procedures, many of which are considered in different timeframes, some of which impact and potentially enhance or limit others.
Mhm.
Would it be helpful for the PUC to streamline consideration of related planning proceedings?
When I was chairing the commission and I was working through my national association known as NARUT, and we partnered with the National Association that works with state energy offices, NASIO, we did a 2-year project on this with U.S. Department of Energy money. And it's online at NARUT's website of saying, how exactly would you do just what you're saying there, at least in 3 large groups: transmission planning, distribution planning, and a generation planning, that they should be done in a sequence, in a cadence that feeds off each other. And that you're using the same data sources, the same understanding of supply and demand, and that the outcome of one is the input to another, and you build a system like that. I think it's exactly it. It's going to take a big push, and I don't know if commissions who are overwhelmed by what they're doing are going to ever get to that point other than through exhaustion. So it may, again, need an outside push from someone else, such as a legislature, to say,
Okay,
maybe we've put too much on you.
thank you. And here's one from Ron Sinton. Great talk. Given that renewables are nearly 100% upfront capital costs with fuel being free, it seems that the potential for utility profit is much higher than with fossil fuel. Is the 50% target ownership of generation too high to be in the public interest? Can the commissioners use their discretion to set a lower number?
I believe this is the 50% that the utility came to the legislature, wanted 100% ownership of everything that was done to replace existing assets, and they then compromised to 50. So that's in law. So I don't think the commission can change that. But what is interesting to reflect upon is the utility finally took the utility a while to even see an interest in investing in renewables. And it now is. The challenge is there's so much less steel and concrete in each of those that there's just not enough places to put their money. So unlike when you invested in a coal plant or a gas plant or a nuclear plant, it's a lot of money, a lot of steel, a lot of concrete, a lot of capital to buy. So that's why, for many reasons, I think you're seeing a growth in PacifiCorp, Xcel, others sort of sitting on a fair amount of capital. They're trying to figure out where to invest in and showing a renewed interest in transmission. So yeah, so I think that's the challenge is it's just not, there's just not enough places to stash away capital.
Okay, thank you. We're at the 7 o'clock hour, and we do call this an Empower Hour. So we'd like to just pause here to acknowledge that and thank you again. And also thank you for being willing to hang on a little bit longer for Empower Hour after hours. I'll turn it over to Mary to do a closing, and then to Steve Whitaker to carry on with the Q&A for after hours. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you so much, Chairman Ackermann. What an interesting perspective you bring. I just want to take a moment to thank the other Empower Our Future communication team members who make these Empower Hours possible. They are Paul Cullinan, Chris Hoffman, Steve Whitaker, and Julie Zonizer. Again, later this week, we'll have the video up on our website at empowerourfuture.org/events. And you'll be able to find all of our other Empower Hours there. And more soon regarding our December Empower Hour. Thank you so much. And again, we'll continue the conversation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mary. So we'll continue with Empower Hour After Hours. And the next question is from Lauren Swain. The question is whether the PUC should require investment in rooftop or community solar to limit transmission costs. Why the market bringing in? Why is
yeah, or why is it or why is it not? I think what the commission is best at in not necessarily choosing the answer of saying we want these assets brought on as the solution, but this is really the next iteration of all source bidding, is saying we have a problem, we want it solved. These are the criteria which we want it solved. And how do you bring the cost of transmission into that conversation? Because up to now, the state has done a noble job and a best practice job of comparing generation assets against each other and comparing what they deliver to the system in terms of both energy and capacity. I think what you also want to do is say, how do these assets, as you're bidding in, say, what does it do to avoid other investments? And there's probably a way that's sort of beyond my non-technical mind to do that, but to put a value on saying, we have a trade-off. We can build, let's say, this line, if we're going to build a line from Northwest Colorado to Northeast Utah, and we'll know what that'll cost and what we think the benefits will be. Is there a way to compare that against investments in generation instead, or investments in load management instead, and say, what is the best way to do that? I think that's my best kind of way to answer that question. It's an imperfect answer because there's a complexity there, but it goes back to that point of blending transmission planning with distribution planning with generation or resource planning all at once. And that's what we need to evolve toward.
Thank you. The next question is from Leslie Glustrom. I appreciate your suggestion on engaging at the state legislature. Many of us spend a fair bit of time doing that, but without Senator Fenberg or Senator Hansen, we don't have strong leaders. Do you have specific suggestions? Do you have specific legislation drafted and ideas about how to move it forward?
Leslie, great to hear you. I will say that a couple of things. One, you're right. Fenberg, good leadership there. Hansen, as he now moves into the world of running a co-op, there's a void there. But I think it's an opportunity because in part, one of the things I'm trying to signal is that maybe the next iteration of achieving some of these energy policy objectives is to make them less overt energy policy objectives and make them social policy objectives or economic policy objectives. So how to blend your message with a message of how do we better manage the long-term or future or even near-term prices of electricity and natural gas? How do we look out for the least of us as a public policy in this space? Like I put forth in my my chart there, in a more thoughtful, comprehensive way of changing the expectations upon the utility. I think if you move in that direction, I think you will find some very compelling new champions in the Senate. I think you've got an incoming president of the Senate who is receptive to hearing sort of these more social economic policies, for example, in President Coleman. I think the incoming Senator Kipp, moving from the House to the Senate, and her background, and she's a alumni of our Clean Energy Legislative Academy, is interested in this space. I think you've got a great social justice champion in Mike Weissman coming over from the House to the Senate. Three great folks who could easily and are open, and I've chatted with them informally about some of these things. And I think, but again, it's moving in a slightly different and possibly broader direction, but don't just look at it immediately as to here's the next iteration of clean energy policy, but here's the next iteration of good social policy, good socioeconomic policy that has a clean energy aspect to it. I think it's changing that conversation. And I think some of the things I put forward, whether it's this notion of at-cost electricity or changing how you approach ROE or changing what you expect of the utility, are all ways in lieu of actually saying we're taking your utility away from you, is saying we are going to change the rules that we think are appropriate to change of what it means to be an investor-owned utility in the state. And if you still want to be one, that's fine, but this is a more reasonable set of rules for the 21st century. And how do you have that discourse? And it's not just for clean energy, it's for what's a reasonable thing, because I contend that we're overdue for seeing a bit of a revolt from the consumers having to do with electric and gas. And that revolt could be damaging to the clean energy objectives, or it could be channeled and used effectively to carry out more clean energy policy.
Thank you. The next question is from Susan McFadden. Can you speak to how non-regulated G&T that have little technical or economic qualified board members, mayors, that don't value needs of low income, air quality, and environmental goals, and go rogue and are not in line with the state goals? Should PUC have some oversight, like Tri-State, so that another Colorado Ute bankruptcy doesn't occur?
So if I'm hearing that right, it's not saying just about Tri-State as a G&T, because that's been interesting on and off. And I watched the law change to bring Tri-State under the commission's purview for resource planning. And And we're sort of a mixed bag, yet Tri-State is moving in the right direction. Whether it's fast enough or not is good for general discourse over a stiff drink. But to the others, if I'm hearing in there other G&Ts, or I'm hearing in there that you're going to, PRPA and places like that, I think I'm having to reflect and pause a bit on that as to how do you bring them in? Because you're right. In theory, those folks are held accountable to their voters if they're a mayor who's then representing their municipality up to the PRP board or equivalent. But it's a long roundabout process that doesn't put a lot of pressure right on the back or the back of the neck of those folks. So I think I'd have to kind of ponder that a bit more of how exactly do you draw them in. I think sometimes the municipals many times have more of a relationship to the federal government than they do to the state government, and like through Western Area Power and folks like that. So it's a matter at times of seeing, could that ever be changed at the federal level? Because Western Area Power can both be an ally and a problem. And many times I saw staffing the commission, working at the commission, being a commissioner, because their objectives have really very little to do with clean energy. Their objectives have to do with delivering water to end use water customers. And by extension, that water happens to generate electricity. And then by extension, that electricity is delivered to municipal governments. There's very little in there that says, and while we're at it, let's see if we can do this clean and efficiently and effectively for the long-term benefit of society. How do you pivot that around so that Western Area Power's mission changes? And by extension, if we're talking about, that's how you get municipals involved, I think. To an entity like Platte River, I'd have to give that more thought as to how are they set up? What is their relationship to WAPA, or who really has influence over them? Because you're right, it's a very challenging relationship between them and the state government, for example. They're sort of an afterthought. So I have an incomplete answer for you, admittedly.
Thank you. So the next question is from James Gilbert. In the ideal grid planning world for you, 1, what should be CETA's role? 2, how does that fit in with the transition to RTOs/ISOs?
Oh, fascinating. I think it's two different things. I think CETA, and the way Senator Hansen and others envisioned it, and the law has been written and slightly rewritten, I think it's at its best when it becomes the arbiter over in-state transmission sort of project siting, planning, and especially procurement, and says, we're taking this out of the hands of Excel or Tri-State or whoever else seems to be dominant in that space. And how do we make that more of a neutral and effective market? So I think they're at their best in that intrastate space. They are going to have trouble moving into the interstate space in any role other than a soft just engagement role of, hey, we'll be part of the conversation because of our federalism system, where anything that's interstate is the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So that now moves you over to this ongoing conversation about how in the West are we going to develop an organized market of some sort. And because we have exchanges in the West, they're just not efficient. They're just bilateral agreements, and they're just using the system in sort of crude 1950s, 1970s ways. And we know it needs to be improved, but we're in a world where we're learning that every structure we design is a human design structure, which means other humans then spend time trying to figure out how to manipulate the system because it's an imperfect system. So starting with that as a premise, one of my personal objectives in putting my hat on at Gridworks, we put a paper and a project together and engaged the consumer advocates from 4 Western states, 2 red, 2 blue states, and said, your voice needs to be in here more than just as a gong, a clanging gong saying why this is not good for consumers. The way AARP has said, do not develop a Western market because it's not good for consumers. But say, if you're going to do it, how do we take what we've learned at the state and realizing the decision-making is going to move from Denver for Denver-based things to, who knows, to some spot in Sacramento or some spot in Little Rock or some spot in who knows where, Salt Lake. How do we make sure that that decision is still truly a public interest-based decision where the needs of the consumer and the needs of the public are not just a thought included in the recipe, but are the cornerstone of how the decisions are made? that kind of system can be created and should be created. And I think that's what you're going to have to figure out is we're a fair ways off from that. We're going to see improvement in the market side of the sharing of extra capacity and energy. When we get to the transmission side, all bets are off, because back to my earlier point, there's a lot of pent up capital waiting to be invested there in utilities, as well as private capital, third-party capital. And they're all looking to create a system where they all can kind of share the spoils. And we got to watch for that.
Great, thank you. Again, we have a question from Lauren Swain.
Mm-hmm.
How can municipalization address these issues? Do existing munis successfully avoid some of these costs and issues or not?
Well, I think if you had a perfect blank slate, you would see that a lot of your municipal utilities do have the benefit that they do not have to deal with having a profit margin or having a return to shareholders. That what they're looking at is they still need to have a margin, but they use the margin differently, and they use the margin for reinvestment in what's good for their system and what's good for the community. And so I think there is, in the abstract, the opportunity to look at things through that lens and say that municipalization, at least at the distribution level, works well. Now, it's probably not that you don't call it municipalization when you talk about like an entire transmission system, but say we talked about the Western transmission system and we made it analogous to the Western highway system and said, what if the public owned that system? Would it operate differently? And is that at all feasible to have that as a publicly owned system but it's different than the way we allocate costs to trucks and cars based on usage, and we're getting a little better at how to do that. Could you have a publicly owned transmission system and you allocate out costs and monitor there without the downside of when the public runs things, it can sometimes get overwhelming. So there is some upside to municipalization. I think in a place like Boulder or others where there's a long history of it not being that way, it's hard to unwind it, untie it, and get back to municipalization though. So it's not really something to draw upon to say, hey, that would work here in an existing community. It works only in the rare spot where you're starting from scratch.
Thank you. Next question is from Bill Althouse. PUC VPP rule and Senate Bill 218 will mandate performance-based compensation for prosumers who deliver power, capacity, auxiliary services, reserves, and distribution upgrade deferrals. As the first state to define a prosumer with these economic benefits, could Colorado become the Silicon Valley of distributed resources?
And I admire what's been done here. I admire my colleague, Tom Plant, and we've crossed paths at the Energy Office and a little bit at the Center for the New Energy Economy. And now he's become a great champion of virtual power plants, VPP, at the commission and by extension with the legislature. I think I think there's a great opportunity to bring the VPP concept in and force it to answer some of the earlier questions where you're adding more holistic, comprehensive value to what does all the pieces of what customers bring in use of their own generation, their own storage, their own ability to adjust load, the way they charge their vehicles, et cetera. There's a lot of opportunity there. And I think I think these rules, which I haven't followed the detail of the rules, is a great way to force that into the planning process, as is the planning process. So I think that has a good upside. It still bumps into this question that former Governor Ritter, my boss, and I spent a chunk of time the first half of this year facilitating a group of folks that the Energy Office asked us to take over the task to try and figure out what's the next phase of net energy metering. Kind of spoiler alert, we did not come up with a grand solution in that, but I think there is a growing awareness that the way that self-generation on end-use customers is compensated does need to go through a transition. It does need to change in the incentives, but it's back to sort of my opening thoughts on this conversation too. What are our objectives for this? And then how do we compensate it and make the system still function appropriately? But you have an opportunity here to have your end use customer put his or her own capital or his or her own signature on the line in a lease or ownership. And you want to encourage that, but you want to encourage that in a way that yields a better system at the same time and yields an incentive for customers. So I think there is a way to do that. I think there is a way for us to succeed where California has not in distribution in distributed resources. And not only solar and storage, but the whole spectrum of distributed energy resources, which is a large list of things to think about and changes depending who you're talking to. But I think there's great opportunity there, and we should explore that. And who knows, we could become that Silicon Valley of DER.
Great, thank you. So Jim Morse has a question: how to limit the money that utilities put into lobbying, campaign contributions, and public relations framing of possible solutions, and money given to governors, presidents, and politicians.
I believe this is what Senator Fenberg and his counterpart, Representative McCluskey, worked on in 2023 in their committee called the Committee on High Utility Bills, because they did come up with a law that does specifically call these and other expenses out, and says these are not ratepayer expenses that can be put into base rates and return from the customer. They are instead put on the shareholder. So there is some progress there. It is a good model that's used. The commission has been doing its best to turn some of that into rules and then figure out how that will roll into future rate cases. I think there's a lot more work that could still be done there, and other ways to look at what are appropriate costs. It is an imbalanced conversation to this day between those who are watching out for what goes into the rate base and the utility who tells you what they want in rate base.
Great, thank you. As you can see, Jim has a follow-up here. To what extent do the bond companies that loan money to utilities for GNT have political influence over politicians and courts?
Oh, interesting question. I'm sure they do. Yeah, everybody who, it's one of the favorite lines we never deferred enough when it comes around holiday time and you pull out the classics and you watch White Christmas, and Bing Crosby says, everybody's got an angle. And so you got to realize everybody's got an edge of what they're trying to achieve. And so if bond companies think they can do more by having lobbyists and changing the rules on bond companies, we haven't found a way to truly restrict lobbying. But in this, I think the question here is sort of, how do we make sure that these circular things, that they don't show up now manipulating legislators and legislatures to come up with laws and practices at commissions that then favor them inappropriately. I don't know if bond issuance has been an issue there or not, but it's an interesting question. It's something to ask in so many different times.
Great, thank you. And Martin Volker is just clarifying that GNTs are generation and transmission power cooperatives. So thank you, Martin. Lawrence Wayne has another question, if we have time, and I think we do. Can you describe how wholesale generation could play a role in current and future ERPs?
Well, Lauren, actually, I believe it does. I think Colorado is fairly good at this. Our electric resource planning process, our ERP, in phase 1, where the parties at length will argue over what the criteria should be against which competitive bids of generation, wholesale generation, will be evaluated, and through which kind of modeling structure or structures, and to ask which sensitivity and scenario questions, is a great model. We work that fairly well. In that model, wholesale generation, third parties, as well as utility-owned bids or utility kind of tight agreements with third parties that create like buy, build, transfer arrangements, brings wholesale in fairly well. So there is a wholesale market that does seem to function fairly well in Colorado. The question is always, is the competitive selection truly functioning competitively? And who's watching that and how well? And because there is some inherent limits in that process. But the upside is we do get them a wholesale competition. We do have a good voice of those folks, the independent power producers, who have been in Colorado for a while and do participate at the commission. Do you want me to, I can even just try and read Leslie's treatise here. versus, let's see, we're talking about legislation on social policy, Senators Coleman, Kip, Weissman, et cetera. Allowing communities to move to nonprofit pub is a fundamental system change. Allow that rather than only trying to change the seats on the IOU ship. Let's see, is it, we have communities all over Colorado able to find lower rates and better community benefits by going to the market. Communities that used to be wholesale customers like Fountain, Yamp Valley, Grand Valley, Holy Cross, and Core Co-op have all gotten better deals, but retail customers of IOUs like Excel and Black Hills don't have that right to go to the market. So the retail IOU customers are becoming like second-class citizens. Shouldn't we allow communities that are retail IOU to have the same rights? Interesting, whether or not that becomes something. I mean, this is sort of an aspect of, if I'm hearing right, Leslie, of what is implicit, if not explicit, in community choice energy, community choice aggregation, and whether coming up with that model would work, or whether there's something wrong in how Excel is allowed, and Black Hills, and how they do their bidding. That's back to that earlier question and our question that says, what are the additional constrictions we put on that Excel process that could get us those better bids of going to the market? Why isn't that market working through the ERP process to get us better bids? It's something worth exploring more. I don't have an answer off the top of my head here this evening, but I think there are, because you're going down two different paths. We could say, well, you put pressure on by having aggregations of customers come in and say, we want direct access to the market in some way. Or you could see whether there's something else the legislature could take interest in and make that happen, whether or not it's still through the utility or not. I'd have to ponder that. We should talk about that some more, and see if there's a best way to do that. So I'm going to leave that as sort of a partially answered question. And then maybe I'm getting tired too, Leslie, but that's about as far as I can take that right now.
Well, it looks like we're approaching the end here. So, and the last one isn't really a question, but I'm going to read it so it gets included in the recording. And it's Lauren Swain to Jim Morrison saying, there is currently a process regarding Senate Bill 23-291 at the PUC. We are pushing for robust reporting and transparency, but it's not guaranteed.
Right. Yeah, I think in closing to that, Steve, there's a lot going on at the commission. The commission has a lot it's trying to initiate on its own. You know, Chairman Blank has taken great leadership on trying to figure out the best way to navigate into the beneficial aspects of regional market. You know, Commissioner Gilman's been doing some great work on the natural gas system conversion and how do you move from gas to electricity, although the major investments they just allowed make you wonder how far and how fast we're going there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you know, Commissioner Plant's doing some great work on versatile power plants, but they have a lot of things that have come at them over the years from the legislature, dating back to, I think, times when I was there, about bringing in equity and environmental justice right straight center into their proceedings in a meaningful way. And the other things they're still supposed to be doing more forthright, including what Senator Fenberg gave leadership to a year ago that still needs to be infused. And they've made some initial headway there, but there's so much more to be done. So I think there's great opportunity there. And so, but I'd say look at both channels, the legislature and the commission. And Leslie, thank you, Leslie, for there is much more to discuss, but currently I have over $1 billion in stranded cost coal assets on Excel's power system. Yes, we do. And the public repeatedly warning Excel and the PUC that the Pueblo 3 unit and the clean air, clean jobs investments in Hayden and Pawnee coal plants, which citizens protested loud and long, should customers now pay off those stranded coal expenditures, or should Excel bear some of the fiscal responsibility for those mistakes? Thanks much. Such interesting questions. I think you're right. I think although there's been several, runs at that, it's far from over. They never did really take securitization seriously, which was not any risk to them at all. They never have, and this is this question about asking fundamentally, do we need to rethink this entity known as an investor-owned utility with help of the legislature, and say, at what point do we say, okay, we have given you a lot and you get away with a lot. How do we recalibrate this a bit? What is an appropriate way to say, you still get the compact is good, but there's more of this that the shareholders should take on in some ways. Yeah.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. And you see Bill Outhouse
Oh,
has
yeah.
another question.
Yeah, Bill's saying net metering discussions are based on mass deployments driving down solar's value when the sun is shining. Can those discussions include increased value of prosumer production? I think clearly, they can. I think the whole net metering conversation is stuck at a bit of an impasse that I think is going to possibly end up in court before it ends up at the legislature, depending on how Holy Cross decides to move forward with what it was proposing a while ago. And when you expand it from just solar to distributed energy resources, sometimes it helps the conversation. Sometimes I think it overwhelms an already complex conversation to a point of paralysis. So I'm not quite sure what's the best path there. Governor Ritter and I struggled earnestly to find a path forward, reported that back to the Energy Office in August. They, I think, took their take on it to the governor's office, who contended it wasn't something this administration was going to take a leadership role in. I still think someone's going to roll something out next year in this space legislatively. I don't know who offhand, but I think you should watch for that and figure out how to open that forum legislatively and see what you want to do next with DERs and net metering. Yeah. Great.
And Leslie just corrects a typo, I believe.
Oh yeah, I see that. Yeah. Yep. It was phonetically correct though.
Okay, well, that's great. And I don't see any further questions. And not that there couldn't be some,
Yeah.
but if we conclude now, there won't be. And,
Very good.
And I wanted to thank you very much for
My
an
pleasure.
illuminating talk and your willingness to answer so many of these questions.
Sure, glad to do it.
Been a
It's been a
great,
pleasure.
it's been a great Empower Hour and Power Hour Plus.
Good.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Good to be with you all. Thanks for the invitation. Best wishes. We'll be back in touch.
Great, thank you.